Down the street from my house was a playground where all the kids in the neighbourhood played. We all loved that park, but one day when I was about 8, the park had been closed to the public. It was off limits. Us kids, of course, got pretty upset as we loved playing in there. Whenever we asked our parents why we couldn't play there anymore, they wouldn't say much about it. The park would remain closed for years, and us kids just kind of forgot about it. It wasn't until 3 years later that I went back to the park. Me and a few friends were walking by one day, and being stupid kids decided to climb the fence and play. When we got over, we started using the swings and chatted about doing stupid stuff. Nothing out of the ordinary. We decided to leave, but on our way out I realised I'd forgotten my sweater, so I ran back to get it. As I was walking back to the swing, I noticed there was a kid playing on the jungle gym. By his appearance, he wasn't much younger than us. I was confused because I don't remember seeing him earlier. I didn't think too much of it though, figuring he was just another kid with the same idea as us. I turned around to leave for a second time and was walking back. Suddenly I noticed him showing signs of struggling, and he fell head first to the ground. I still remember the sound it made when he hit the ground. The blood surrounded him. I screamed and ran crying to tell my parents what had happened. When I started describing the events and what the boy looked like, my parents' faces seemed to drain of blood and became as pale as a ghost. They said nothing, but they did phone the police, who went out there, but they found nothing. No body, no blood, nothing. Surprisingly, my parents weren't mad. In fact, they seemed to be as scared as me. They asked me a lot of questions about that night, and everything I'd explained to them made them paler. The next morning, my parents acted like nothing had happened. It wasn't until last week, 14 years later, that I found out the truth. I was home visiting my parents and I brought up the old park as I'd driven past it on my way. Nowadays I had convinced myself that what I had seen when I was 11 was just my imagination running wild. But when I brought this story up with my mother, she went pale again. She sighed and said, "It's time you know the truth." My mum then tells me the reason the park was closed all those years ago was because a 10-year-old boy who was playing on the monkey bars was hanging upside down when he lost his grip and fell head first down onto the gravel. The kid died within minutes of hitting the ground. All the mums and dads kept it from us as kids in order to not upset us. My mum said that the description I gave of the boy was so spot on, it scared them. That's why they called the police. They didn't know what else to do. My mum then showed me an old news clipping with a picture of the boy and I almost passed out. My mum then showed me an old news clipping with a picture of the boy and I almost passed out. It was him. It was the boy. What does this mean? Did I see a ghost? About 6 years ago, my family and I took a trip to Nantucket, which is a small island off the coast of Massachusetts. We went with another family and their 2 children, who I've known since I was born. I was the only girl between the kids, so they let me go through the enormous house and pick which room I wanted, so long as it wasn't one of the master bedrooms. I picked a beautiful little yellow room. It was smaller than the other rooms, but I picked it because it was covered with windows on 2 sides of the room, and the house had a lovely view of the ocean. I was content in there. The first night was perfect. I got to bed nice and early because we had a big day of sightseeing planned for the next day. The next morning we get up, go biking, exploring, and ended our night with a ghost tour of the island. Our tour guide brought us to a few graveyards, abandoned buildings, and allegedly haunted houses. The tour ended and we go home, say goodnight and get ready for bed. As I walked into my beautiful little room, I knew something was off. My body tensed up. My stomach started to feel sick and anxious. There's no real way to describe it except that I felt this sense of dread and despair overcome me. I felt like something was in the room with me. My mind was telling me that there was definitely somebody else in the room with me. I tried to tell myself it was just a panic attack, so I left to head up to my parents' room. As I walked into their room, they asked me what was wrong. They told me I looked pale. I didn't tell them what had happened, but I tried to talk to them as long as I could before they kicked me out of their room and went to bed. When I finally and reluctantly went back to my room, the sense of dread came back immediately, even worse than before. I started crying. I couldn't control what was going on. I was just full-on sobbing and having trouble breathing because of how violently I was sobbing. I started thinking about dying, how it wouldn't be that bad. I shit you not, there was a voice in my head trying to convince me to kill myself. I felt like death was in the room with me, waiting to take me. I was crying and saying no through my tears, and it felt involuntary. I finally texted my friend who was sleeping down the hall and told him I needed him to come to my room. I told him everything and he could tell I was visibly shaken, so we turned on How I Met Your Mother on Netflix, turned on all the lights, and fell asleep next to each other on my bed. The dread returned the next 3 nights, but the crying never returned. This remains one of the most horrifying experiences of my life. Does anybody know what that is? Was I just having a panic attack? Did something follow me? Any help is appreciated. I awoke to another somber morning. These past few years have just felt like blurs, honestly. Days pass, different faces, different conversations, always a different day. There is only ever one constant in my life. I am terrified to go to sleep. I have been having the same nightmare every time I've slept for the past 10 years. Being only 20, that is effectively half of my life spent living in fear of something we require on a nightly basis. It all started when we moved into our first ever house when I was 10. The rent was cheap in the small town where we were, and the house was too good to pass up. Records showed no violent crime had ever occurred there. No deaths in the house. Nothing to suggest anything amiss. However, upon moving in, I began to experience the most vivid nightmares I'd ever had. Every night I would have the same nightmare. It goes as follows. I wake up in possibly the most comfortable bed I've ever slept in. The sheets are a burgundy colour, and the pillows are goose down with burgundy covers over top. There is a leather recliner, a swivelling fan pointed towards the bed, as well as a small nightstand next to me that has half an empty glass of water and an alarm clock that reads 3:45 a.m. As I lay back down to try and fall back to sleep, I hear something. A child faintly crying. I look around and notice a small figure crouched in the corner, facing away from me, slowly rocking back and forth, letting out muffled sobs. I slowly make myself get out of bed to go see what is wrong. I walk towards the little girl, trying to say something comforting to stop her sobs and get her out of the corner. I ask her if she wants to come sit in the recliner and talk with me. It nods its head and I reach out my hand to take hers and lead her to the recliner, when I notice something. It is completely silent in the room. I no longer hear her small sobs, nor do I hear the whirring of the fan. I can't even hear her breathing. I go to draw my hand back when she grabs my forearm with a force I can't even begin to explain. My bones snap and pierce through my skin. The feeling is absolute agony. I don't know who told me you can't feel pain in dreams, but they're a filthy liar. The girl begins to stand up, still keeping the ungodly amount of force on my arm. The limbs stretch, joints pop, and skin is pulled tight until I'm staring at an almost glowingly white being roughly 7 feet tall, lanky with mangled limbs that bent and stretched in an impossible way, making the same cracks, pops and sounds of tearing flesh with every moment. The skin of its face was pulled so tight it was but a thin membrane. It had no eyes, no nose, just a smooth face with a lipless mouth full of jagged black teeth, with breath that reeked of rotting flesh and spray paint. Though it had no eyes, I could still feel the look of immense hatred it was giving me. It begins to raise its arm up, lifting me by shattered, shredded, and bleeding arms before slamming me to the ground. It proceeds to stomp its foot on top of my head and pull on the arm until it rips off. I know my brain would be making up how it felt, but if I had to guess what having a limb being ripped off would feel like, I can't imagine it's far off. It lifts me from the ground by my hair and grabs a hold of my other shoulder, pushing them apart to expose my neck. It begins to devour me bit by bit, bite by bite, just ruthlessly chewing as I scream in agony at each tear until I finally bleed out. Waking up from the nightmare leaves me in pure shock for at least 10 minutes. I tried explaining this to my mother, but she was very dismissive, saying it was simply a nightmare. She threatened to send me to the loony bin if I didn't stop talking about it. My first experience the outside of dreaming was when I was 12 after one of my nightmares. I don't remember how often he had been there or even if he had been there before, but that doesn't really matter. He was there now. He was a pure black silhouette of a person. By their height and build, I'd assume it was a man, rather large in build. Not large as in appearing muscular, but stocky. The first time he appeared, he was in the corner of the room, roughly 10 feet away, standing and staring. He stayed like that every night for a long time. I almost didn't realize when he started moving. The figure itself didn't move, but instead, upon waking up, he was not completely in the corner as usual. That week he was that close. The next week he moved a foot closer. The next week, closer. This repeated for a few months until eventually I woke up to him standing right beside my bed. Unable to move, all I could do was watch and listen. His ragged breath sounded as though he smoked 20 packs a day for 20 years. His body shook accordingly, but his breath and the strangest smell, lavender. I laid there staring at him for what felt like hours until he vanished with no real hint it would happen. I eventually rolled out of bed and immediately felt as though I'd been hit by a bus. My body was covered in bruises. After my last experience, I didn't see him for a long time. The nightmares continued per usual, but no sleep paralysis afterwards for an odd reason. At around 14, I began trying to stay awake for as long as possible in order to avoid sleep. Recreational drugs as well as video games was all that was between me and nightmare. My record remains at 13 days. This is where things begin to get weird. Many of the things I experienced could be explained away as a lack of sleep, making me experience auditory and visual hallucinations. This said, there are things that hallucinations can't do. This next one was probably one of the worst experiences I had had, and which led me to stopping my medications. I had been taking sleeping meds since I would refuse to sleep for days on end, making me prone to getting sick and doing poorly in school. Every night I went to sleep, had the normal nightmare, then faded to blackness and stayed in that state until when I would eventually wake up. But this time was different. I didn't bleed out, or whatever you'd prefer to call it. Instead, I got to experience it for the rest of my sleep. Instead of 10 to 15 minutes of pain at the most, I experienced it for hours, what felt like days even, just constantly tearing flesh from my body, moved to my limbs once the side of my neck was thoroughly eaten. When I awoke, I smelt lavender. Though I could see no expression, he sounded as though he were laughing. A deep, guttural, gravely sounded. a deep, guttural, gravelly-sounding laugh. As I continued to look at him, I noticed his mouth, jagged black teeth. Suddenly, he was gone. I make my way downstairs to a completely empty house. I remember thinking I was late for school and hurriedly getting ready. When I stepped into the bathroom, I saw my little sister laying on the floor in a pool of blood with a smile full of jagged black teeth. I jolt awake in a panic and see him in despair as I'm coming to. I run downstairs to see my family, all looking concerned at my state of distress. My mother leads me to a chair and has me sit down and starts rubbing my shoulders to me relax. Then I noticed something. Lavender. Before I could react to what was once my mother, it began clawing into my neck and gouging at my eyes, all while giving the man's low gravelly laugh. I scream in terror. Then I wake up, still smelling that horrid odour. I look in the mirror to see my face covered in scratches. I was oddly happy, excited almost. My mother surely can't ignore this. I go downstairs, ready to show my mum I wasn't crazy, but she paid me no attention, simply told me to eat breakfast and go to school. I went to school defeated, head down all day. It passed dismally as always. I went to the school gym accompanied by my best friend John to do my daily workout and get my mind off it. I went to walk to the bench press and nearly puked when I walked past John. Lavender. Before I could react, he struck me in the back of the head with a barbell. As I lay there more dazed than in pain, he began viciously attacking me. Every hit broke a different bone. With every break, his smile seemed to get bigger. He hit me in the head once more and I awoke in my bed. The man stood there laughing as he had before. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to lunge at him and try to cause at least some of the pain he's caused me, but I couldn't move. He lit a cigarette and began walking around the room, mumbling incoherent sentences to himself, throwing in understandable words here and there. Amongst the bumbling I heard laugh, hunt, fire, and swing. I still have no clue what any of those could have been used in, but I didn't like any ideas that came. He walked over to me, putting the cigarette out on my face before saying, "Just pay attention for me." I woke up and felt my face. No burn, sadly and thankfully, just the smell of lavender. Something's different though. My room reeks of cigarettes. My mother, of course, didn't believe that I wasn't the one who smoked inside, and I was beaten as well as the average 5'4" mother can do to an almost 6-foot tall person. I went to school and had a relatively normal day until I got to math class. Nearing the last 10 minutes of class, I smelt that sickening scent of lavender and prepared for the worst, but nothing happened. It took me a second to process what was going on, but once I did, I wish I hadn't. He'd followed me to school, so where else could he follow me? The implications of this was not lost on me, but I had no clue the extent this could go. Needless to say, I didn't go home that night. I walked in the house at about 7 a.m. to get new clothes and have breakfast. Let's just say my mother's reaction to seeing me come in was not a happy one. I'll leave the details out. I walked to school utterly terrified. What was once considered a safe zone was now his private monitoring area, and I was unsure what he may do. School went by uneventful, and I went in for my after-school workout accompanied by John. Everything seemed normal, if not a little empty. We finished our hour and went for the showers. My scatterbrained self left my towel in the gym, so I threw my shorts on and walked through the doors to the gym. My towel was just to the right of the door. I reached out for it and didn't realize anything was off, but then I noticed it, and I was scared stiff, unable to move. Lavender. I look around, not seeing anything. Just a silent, empty room with a single locker open. Then I hear it, creaking metal. Once I hear it, I noticed that the locker was slowly swinging back and forth, just an inch back and forth. There is a crash and the medicine balls on top of the locker fall as the locker slammed shut. It began feeling as if the room was vibrating. My ears felt as if they would burst and my eyes began losing focus. Thinking I was going to pass out, I used that little focus I can to manage to try and open the door, but it won't budge. I tried to put my foot on the wall to use it as leverage, but nothing. It may as well have been welded in place. With my vision fading, I thought this was how I was going to die. Out of nowhere, John opened the door, leaving me falling back, asking what the hell I was doing. I wanted to tell him what was happening, but I was sure he'd think I was insane. I told him I was messing with some stuff, and he gave me a confused look. Okay, I'll take your word for it. He didn't seem satisfied by my answer, but he didn't press further. I heard him sniff a little bit and nearly died all over again at his next sentence. Were you spraying perfume in here? He smelled it too, the first hint that someone else was aware of it. I must have been staring for longer than I thought, as he repeated himself. Oh, no, I smelt it when I came in. Not sure who would have done it, I said. He cocked an eyebrow at me and put on his shit-eating grin. Oh, sure, zRaps came through and sprayed it all over the place. I laughed, trying not to let on how in shock I still am. We left school and decided to have a quick toke and play a few video games. 10 p.m. rolled around and I had to go home. Walking in, I was unsurprised to see that everyone was in bed. My family always were the early risers type. I walked up to my room and turned on my Xbox, making sure the volume on the TV was all the way down. I played until 6:45 a.m. so that I could turn everything off and act as though I'd slept. This continued for 3 days before my mother started to notice just how exhausted I was. I told her the nightmare had just been a little more vivid lately, and she accepted that answer with little fight. School passed as always, up until 6th period, about 1:45 p.m. for us if you're curious, which I had as a study hall. I began working on as much of my homework as possible when I noticed something. Everyone was staring at me. They all wore the same flat, blank expression, as if I were the most dull thing they've ever had the displeasure to witness. They began chanting incoherent sentences, softly at first but growing in volume. Once they were all nearly shouting, they began walking towards me, the blank expressions slowly changing to ones of joy. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, I wanted to do anything really, but I couldn't move. Each student began taking pencils and stabbing them into various parts of my body. One in the arm, on the leg, the stomach, eyes, just stabbing what seemed open. Finally, the last person walked over and positioned the pencil outside my ear before slamming his hand onto it as hard as he could. I awoke in a panic, kicking the table away and falling back in my chair, all the while swinging at the air. I attempted not to vomit from the thick scent in the air that nobody seemed to notice this time. I wasn't unsuccessful. Upon questioning, I simply stated I must have fallen asleep and had a nightmare. I was sent home after puking and spent the rest of the day outside. While walking around town, I heard 2 words come from behind me and nearly jumped out of my skin. Always here. I'm starting to learn now. He might not have been lying. I'll start at the beginning, as I have a plethora of creepy stories and strange occurrences. These are all my personal experiences and are based on memory, so bear with me. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I had 4 friends that lived on my street, and I often played with them: Vincent, Kyle, Mike, and Colin. Our homes rested on a hill that overlooked an empty plot of land with an unused sewer pipe that jutted out of the hillside. The legend was that the pipe system would eventually get so complex that people would get lost, even construction workers. Feeling brave, we decided to explore the pipes. Kyle had a dog named Kilo, a lab mix, so we all felt confident we could find our way out, and one summer morning we decided to test our luck and see how far we could go. At the entrance to the main drain pipe at the bottom of the hill, upon which all of our houses rested, Kyle's dog Kylo began to show unusual behaviour. He wouldn't enter the drain pipe. After some coaxing and enough treats, Kilo finally entered. Armed with flashlights, our merry gang of 5 entered the sewer system, determined to emerge as triumphant heroes who feared nothing. About 30 feet into the gaping maw of what would become the source of my nightmares for years to come, the tunnel split into 2. Our group decided that Vincent and I would take the tunnel to the right, and the rest of the gang would go to the left. "Shout if you're in trouble," was the last I'd heard from Kyle. Vincent and I trudged on down this winding tunnel, and whether it was determination or hope to come to a dead end I can't say. 10 minutes into exploring this deviation from the main drain pipe, Vincent and I heard a scream. Immediately we turned back and ran as fast as our legs would carry us until we reached the split in the tunnel. More screams welcomed us, along with the shrieks of an animal experiencing the last moments of its life. We ran until we found Kyle, Mike, and Colin. All 3 were frozen in fear, as if some spell had frozen them to the ground. I directed my flashlight beyond them, and what was illuminated was a wall. Slowly I angled my flashlight up the wall until I saw it. There was a gap between the wall and the roof of the sewer. A humanoid figure was hanging out of the gap, its skin the colour and texture of moss. Its limbs were withered, and within its hands was the head of Kilo. A mouth of razor-sharp teeth were gnawing at Kilo's skull, and as I noticed this creature, its eyes met with mine. At this point my mind goes blank, and the next thing I remember is waking up in my bed. Kilo was never seen again, and Kyle never spoke from that day until I moved. Hey fearsome friends, long time no speak. Just want to say a big thank you to everyone who has contributed and supported my channel. I will at some point soon be going live, and I'm toying with the idea of videoing my narration. If you'd like to see me reading the stories, let me know in the comments below. Please like, share and subscribe, and remember, keep being creepy.